What does a penny pincher, a multiple marathon runner, and a workaholic have in common? The answer to this question is the topic of today's video, which is the first in the series on the canon of health. And as you remember from the intro, I'm trying to build these videos on the acronym BEST Life, and the first letter of this acronym B stands for balance. You're right, all these people lack sufficient balance in their life. And if you stick with me to the end of this video, I'm going to give you 3 tips that will be very helpful to bring back balance in your life. Let me start by telling you a couple of stories. First of all, Daniel Dancer, who was a farmer in the 1700s in England, and he inherited some good amount of money and goods from his father, but he was such a penny pincher that he spent his life and his sister with him for a good portion of her life until she passed by saving literally every penny that they could save. I mean, they went as far as to eat only cooked old bones and old dumplings. He would rarely take a bath, and when he did so, he would not use soap. All of these things in an attempt to save as much money as possible. And when he died, the story goes, and I have my reserves in terms of believing the actual amount, but the story goes that if we were to convert what was found after he died in his house, it was the equivalent of $2.2 billion in today's money. Now, we don't have to go that far back in time to find people so badly out of balance. I have seen among my patients people who sometimes lack balance in what seems to be a good way. I have a gentleman in his 70s who has run more than 25 marathons in his life. I have another lady who's getting close, and she's going on this ultra-long resistant running races where they go for 24 hours or even more. And when I sit down and talk to them, sometimes I ask them, what's in this for you? Why do you do these things? And oftentimes I hear an answer along the lines of, I want to test myself. I want to push myself to see what my limits are. How far can I push myself? And while there's value in doing that maybe once or twice in your lifetime, I think doing it over and over and over again is an extreme, is a manifestation of lack of balance. And when I look and present these things to you, please understand that I'm not immune either. I'm oftentimes tempted to go overboard in various aspects of my life. My mother was a workaholic. I remember she would wake up before the first rays of light, and she would go on working all day long until she went to bed at night, and the next day she would start over again, and that was her life. And as a child growing up, I was puzzled sometimes, why is she working so hard? What's going on here? But then again, in my life, I find myself sometimes doing the same thing, and sometimes we do it for fun. And again, I think there's a place and time when we can push ourselves. This summer, for example, I went on a 13-hour hike close to a marathon length, but it was up the mountain and down. And other than half an hour where we stopped to eat with my son and a relative from Romania, we went for the whole 13 hours. And we felt it. I mean, the next day, everything was aching like crazy. So I'm not saying we should never do anything like this, but I think the lack of balance is one of the biggest missing pieces in people's lives beyond their immediate problem, whether it's diabetes, high blood pressure, stress, anxiety, depression, whatever it is. The inability to bring balance in life is oftentimes at the foundation of their problem. And sometimes it's paradoxical because you see people who are actually very focused on certain health habits, and yet they still lack balance. I've seen many people who go to great lengths to eat a healthy diet, and they are very particular about searching for the best foods and making efforts to buy organic only. And yet when it comes to exercise, they hardly do anything. Or the opposite, you have people exercising and dialing that to the extreme where they check their heart rate, and they want to be in that target heart rate zone for most of their exercise, and they want to build muscle. But then when it comes to sleep, they stay until after midnight every night and play video games or whatever. And then the next day they go to the gym to build muscle. So there is this imbalances all over the place that we too often ignore. And the list can go on. I mean, imagine how much time you and I and others around us spend every week in front of a screen, not producing stuff, not creating anything productive, but just consuming. That's a major imbalance, isn't it? And just to illustrate this, because you may wonder, so what's the big deal? What if I don't have perfect balance in my life? The universe is still going to go and life is going to move on, whether I live a totally balanced lifestyle or not. And while that is correct, balance is so fundamental to our existence and to our health. So if you want to have quality of life and longevity, balance is a must. It's not something optional that you may or may not choose to put in your daily life. I'll give you a couple of examples here. One is from my own life. When I was in my late teen, early 20 years, military service was mandatory in Romania. So I went for 9 months of military service. And in the first couple of months, it was very intense. They would train you very hard physically. And we were on a very strict regimen. Like literally at 9:30, the lights would go off and you had to go to sleep. 5:30 in the morning, the lights were on and you had to wake up. And meal times were very regimented. Everything was to a routine that I had never had before. And after a few weeks on this routine, I started to feel great, physically speaking, even though I was tired and after those first weeks we were all aching. But past that moment, everything was running like clockwork. It was amazing, even though the food was some of the worst I've ever eaten in my life. But that routine itself and this equilibrium between physical activity, between rest, going to sleep at the proper time, created a magic almost feeling of wellness in my life that I really enjoyed at that time. But this is just my example, and perhaps those of you who have been in the military may identify with this. I'm sure you would. But there is more to this than just my own experience. So I'll share with you here something about the so-called Goldilocks zone for physical activity or exercise. And I think this illustrates very eloquently this idea of balance, in the sense that too little is bad for you. Too much is also bad for you, but there is this sweet spot in the middle where you get the most benefit. And this is exactly what research shows. Like if you look at this article, which is a classic in the field of this idea of balance in physical activity, the Goldilocks zone for exercise, not too little, not too much. What these folks are showing is this classic U-shaped or J-shaped curve where if you never exercise, your risk of coronary artery disease, for example, is quite high. But as you start to exercise even once per week, you see how it drops like a rock here, and it drops some more if you go 2 to 3 times a week, and even more a little bit, or it kind of plateaus between 4 and 6 times per week. But if you start to do daily, and I'm talking here about strenuous exercise, like really intense, where you sweat, you really work hard, you start to see an increase in risk after a certain amount of such exercise. And the same picture can be painted from studies in people who have already had a cardiovascular event, such as a heart attack. All-cause mortality in green and cardiovascular mortality in brown. As you increase the amount of exercise, you can see how the risk of further events goes down, but after a certain level here, it starts to go back up again, exactly the same picture. The amount of exercise that seems to be too much is running more than 7 kilometers a day, which would be about 4 miles a day, or walking briskly more than 10 kilometers a day. So that's probably more than 6-7 miles a day of brisk walking. And again, the same exact idea with the risk of atria fibrillation, which is a kind of a dangerous rhythm disorder. Here you see in men over 65 years of age, if you don't exercise at all, your risk is pretty significant. As you start to exercise more and more, up to moderate intensity, your risk goes down. But if you go over that level and you overdo it, the atrial fibrillation risk goes up. Interestingly enough, it doesn't go all the way up to where it was if you didn't exercise at all, but it does go up. And to summarize, I have to say a couple of things at least here in regards to physical activity. First of all, most people do too little. So don't take what I said so far to mean that, oh, I shouldn't exercise because it's dangerous for me. Quite the contrary. You do need, the majority, 95% of Americans that I met and know and seen in my office every single day have a severe deficiency of physical activity. So please go and do the exercise that you need. But if you do that, for those 5% that overdo it, please dial it down a little bit and try to find your Goldilocks zone there. You know, if you look at the official recommendations, they are about 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise, or if you're talking about vigorous intensity exercise, you know, exercise that you sweat right away as you do it, about 75 minutes per week. Especially if you are over 45 years of age, it's important to not overdo it. I kind of beat this horse to death here, but just one more thing about this in older people. This is a study comparing multi-marathon runners, people who run at least 25 marathons in their lifetime, compared to people who never run a marathon. And you see here the amount of plaque that these people have. This plaque is a precursor of heart attacks and strokes, so it's important to not have plaque in our arteries. And what do you see in these marathon runners? Quite a bit more plaque, 200 versus 126 in the non-marathon runners. So this is serious business, you know, in those who overdo it. But the point is well taken that we are out of balance oftentimes, either doing too little or sometimes doing too much. We need to hit that sweet spot in the middle, and somehow human nature is such that we tend to go to the extreme or to the other rather than to stay where we should be most of the time. So let me share with you 3 tips that have been very helpful for me to bring some balance in my life, because my nature is not very balanced. I'm very driven. The first one is to cut the cable. And by that, I mean the TV cable, okay? We haven't had cable TV for many years now in our family, and I'm very grateful for that because it's a huge time thief. You really get caught into all those programs, and I remember watching this series on that and that other series on Discovery and so forth. And before you know it, every week you end up wasting hours and hours of precious time. Especially, you know, when you get caught into the news cycle of politics. You get into all these intrigues and all these investigations on and those allegations of this and that and everything else. And again, you waste a lot of time. Think back at least 2 election cycles back here in the United States. Do you still care about the news cycle that every day kept you glued to the TV if you happen to be in that situation today? Wouldn't you want to have that time back so you can do something more useful, something more long-lasting for your life, for those around you, than to just watch those things and waste your emotions on those intrigues that you didn't gain anything out of other than perhaps being manipulated into one direction or another at the end of all of that, and feeling disappointed and becoming more cynical about the whole politics of things. So I'm not here advocating about detaching from reality and never voting or getting involved in politics, but again, the balance here, you know who you want to vote for, know what principle you stand for, but don't waste your time following every little move that these people are, unless you are in the field, unless this is what your professional life is. Second tip, it's very important to plan your day, to plan your week, to plan your year, to plan your life ahead of time. because we have very limited time. One of the main reasons balance is so important is because we live on a very limited time allotment in this life. When you are young, you may not realize that, but as you advance in life, you see that end station coming closer and closer to you, and then you look back and you are wondering, okay, so what have I done with my life so far? You see, so if you sit every morning and you have a moment of meditation and introspection and prayer, and you say, okay, what is it that I'm going to do today? What do I plan to do with my life, myself? Other than stuff comes to you and keeps you busy, and you go to work and you have to do this and do that and everything else, and the day ends, and you may not have had any opportunity, if you didn't plan ahead of time, to do the things that are really important for you. So planning is absolutely essential. And number 3, and very important in my life, and I hope if you don't practice this, you will become interested in doing so, is I take one day off every week. Literally. Like, I grew up in a family where we did this, and we continue this in our family. So every 7th day I take off. I don't go to work. I don't do the usual stuff that we do. We try to spend time in the family, talk about other things, go out in nature when we have an opportunity. And this, over the long term, is a great investment in recharging your mental and spiritual batteries. So every week you come out of it fresh and ready to live your life to the fullest for the next 6 days that lay ahead. So I hope these tips and what I told you today is of interest. I'd be curious if you would be willing to share with me what tips have worked for you to bring balance in your life. And until next time, you stay balanced and you stay healthy, my friend.